A notion which before was used very much in the art world, obviously comes from taking care of objects, a caretaker of objects in a museum. Today, it is much, much more than filling a space with object. It has to do with filtering, it has to do with enabling, it has to do with synthesizing, with framing, also with remembering. And it's definitely become clear, sort of seeing the exponential growth of the use of the notion of curator on the internet, that the proliferation of ideas, of information, of images needs somehow obviously a guiding. And it seems also that within this whole information explosion, curating is used more and more. We can see it on Amazon, book lists are being curated. We can see it in magazines, pages are being curated, concept stores are being curated. And Chris Anderson of TED calls himself the curator of TED. So conferences are being curated. So we can say curating goes far beyond the museum. Now that obviously has to do with an expanded notion of curating. It's kind of interesting that in art there has been this idea of erweiterte Kunstbegriff. Joseph Beuys spoke in the 1960s of an expanded notion of art, something also Andy Warhol did. And if we believe, or it's something I believe very strongly, that curating always follows art, it's not the other way around, curating follows art, we can say obviously an expanded notion of art somehow had to lead to an expanded notion of curating, to a bigger variety. I'd like to start by actually talking about my great inspiration, my great mentor, Edouard Glissant. He's not a curator, he's a great novelist, poet, philosopher, founder of a beautiful conceptual museum in Martinique. He was born in 1928 in Martinique and died this year, 2011, on February 3rd in Paris. So I'd like to dedicate this speech to him and actually tell you about him, because I think that he's one of the least still translated authors and one of the most important authors of the 21st century. He's very much what Michel Foucault once wrote, that he hoped that actually writing could be a toolbox. Edouard Glissant is my toolbox. And Tarkovsky said a long time ago, we're living in a time where there are kind of not so many rituals anymore, so we need to invent rituals. And I have these daily rituals that every morning when I wake up, I read 15 minutes of Edouard Glissant, and his sort of thinking really has inspired almost every single exhibition I've curated. Glissant's thought can somehow be following very much an idea that he says thinking can somehow be continental, it's rock solid and imposing, or as he sort of says, it should be an archipelago, which is welcoming and sheltering, which you can see in a drawing which he emailed for a map marathon, which we did on the right-hand side. This whole idea of an archipelago for the 21st century. Glissant's idea has been very much that within globalization, the homogenizing forces obviously are also at stake, and we have different possibilities to answer that. We can answer it either by completely retiring to the local, or we can answer it by sort of embracing these global forces, and that's the risk that then it's all being homogenized. Or we can do what Glissant says, we can follow mondialité, his whole idea of a global dialogue which augments difference, which enhances difference. And this beautiful book, La Cohue du Lamentin, is a great example. The history and landscapes of the Antilles was also actually the topic of his very first novel, La Lézarde, 1958, The Ripening. And his native Creole was formed from a combination of the languages of the French colonial rulers and the African slaves. It contains elements of both, but is itself something independent and unexpectedly new. So this whole idea that Glissant very early on observed many cultural fusions all over the world makes him so important. In 1981, he wrote the Discours Antillais. It's a manifesto for continual fusion. As he said, he once told me, creolization is a process which never stops. A few more words about the archipelago, which I think is such an important curatorial concept Glissant gave us. The Antillean archipelago's geography is important for his thought because the island group has no center, but consists of a string of different islands and cultures. The exchanges that take place between them allows each to preserve their own identity. Maybe a quote here, the American archipelagos are extremely important because it was in these islands that the idea of creolization, that is the blend of cultures, was most brilliantly fulfilled. Continents reject mixings, whereas archipelagic thought makes it possible to say that neither each person's identity nor a collective identity are fixed and established once and for all. I can change through exchange with the other without losing or diluting my sense of self. And that, I think, is very much something curating can do. Glissant wanted to develop a curatorial vision of a museum on Martinique, where he actually imagined this idea, that the idea of the museum today would be to bring the world into the world. My own first exhibition happened in a kitchen in St. Gallen in 1991. I had done a kind of a grand tour and had traveled the world and looked at art, and I thought like everything had been done, and I really didn't know where to start. It was a great struggle, so between 17 and 21, 22, I was searching. And somehow, all of a sudden, speaking to Peter Fischli and David Weiss, who did this wonderful kitchen altar, and also to Christian Boltanski, they said maybe it's like the Edgar Allan Poe letter. Maybe I shouldn't search too far. I should just do the first exhibition in my kitchen, a very intimate show. So I sent out a little letter to 20 people. The exhibition was open for 3 months and had 37 visitors, and subsequently developed into a kind of a rumor. And I mean, General Jupp once said, if we gain concentration, we lose territory, and the other way around. No, if we gain territory, we lose concentration. So if you think about an expanded field of curating, I've always been very worried that this very concentrated experience of my kitchen could be lost. Hence, every couple of years, I kind of repeat the kitchen and appropriate a house. We did it in the Sir John Soane's house in London, and more recently in the house of Federico Garcia Lorca in Granada, where I invited artists. Here is Lorca's bedroom with a piece by Gilbert and George, In Bed with Lorca. So the idea is really that many, many artists came to this house, inhabited the house, and so what we can say, the kitchen somehow never stopped. From the kitchen show, I started to think about lots of different museums. I started to think, I mean, maybe we could sort of invent museums where we would expect them least. And I met a wonderful man in Vienna, Joseph Artner, who sadly died a few years ago. And Joseph Artner had this amazing idea of the museum in progress. A museum which could happen in the streets, a museum which can happen on billboards, a museum which could also happen in all kinds of unexpected places. So speaking to Alighiero Boetti, he told me he would like to exhibit on airplanes. His dream is that with an airline, an exhibition would be carried into the world day by day, and we produced these puzzles, tens of thousands of these puzzles, and it was a very difficult process because over the year, there were actually less and less planes, and then it became almost a monochromatic blue sky. So it became very difficult to do the puzzle again. So the puzzle had exactly the size of the little table on the airplane. Another example, what we're doing with Museum in Progress, is the opera in Vienna. So basically, instead of an iron curtain where people just stare into the void, we have an artist every year who designs a work for the iron curtain. So last year is Cy Twombly, whom we invited to do this curtain. And it's a project which is ongoing, and it's basically a 12-month exhibition. Again, contemporary art in a place where you would expect it least. All Cities on the Move, an exhibition where I started for the first time to curate also architecture with Tuhan Ru, a big exhibition of billboards in all the subway stations with Museum in Progress. Now, this whole connection with architecture is something which has been very important. The billboard idea was followed with our show, The Indian Highway. I started in 2006 to co-direct the Serpentine Gallery, as Vanessa said, with Julia Peyton-Johns. And one of the first shows we did was China Power Station and the Indian Highway. We want to take into account something Glissant again taught us, which is this polyphony of center. And we wanted to show the incredible dynamics of Indian art. So we had the late M.F. Hussain showing his paintings almost like public billboards in an exhibition architecture by Nikolaus Hirsch. We had then lots of different displays in the exhibition. Here the Rax Media Collective developed a whole display with ladders from which and through which you could actually see documentary films. Now these all has to do with space, and obviously it's production of space. And one of the things Boltanski told me very early on, he said we only remember exhibitions which also invent a new rule of the game. Richard Hamilton told me we only remember exhibitions which also develop a new display feature, a new way how art can be displayed. And that's obviously something artists try again and again, to invent new display feature. Here Hamilton himself, in his legendary treatment room, which we showed in the Serpentine Gallery, or Philippe Pareno, with a completely new display feature for film, a time code through the exhibition, and then artificial snow around the Serpentine Gallery. Now, thinking a lot about architecture, at some point, obviously, one can do lots of things within the art world with architecture, but it obviously becomes very interesting also to build. And Julia Peyton-Johns, together with Zaha Hadid, had in 2000 this vision to develop a pavilion for the Serpentine Gallery. When we started to collaborate in 2006, the first pavilion we did together was with Rem Koolhaas and Cecil Balmont. And the idea was that Julia's invention of the pavilion went together with something I had started, which are the marathons. Because at some point I started to think, could I maybe not only curate art, curate science, curate architecture, but could one maybe also curate conferences? Could one bring the expertise and the knowledge of inventing new rules of the game into the field of conferences, where usually one has a speaker and one has all kinds of, a round table, but could one somehow come up with new rules of the game? So the marathon was born, and it's kind of a 24-hour polyphonic platform where all kinds of disciplines would meet. It's very inspired by open-air music festivals, and the idea would be that people come and go, sometimes fall asleep, and the conversation would always be ongoing. So Rem Koolhaas and I invited many different speakers. It culminated after 24 hours. We didn't go to sleep, and we stayed on stage for 24 hours and spoke to 72 Londoners. So it was also kind of an attempt at making a portrait of a city, and it culminated in a very, very wonderful message Doris Lessing gave us after these 24 hours to somehow conclude the day. These marathons developed into a whole series. When the year after Olafur Eliasson and Kjetil Thorsen did the pavilion, Olafur thought we had somehow talked too much, and it would really be better now to do something. So we stopped talking and we did an experiment marathon. So for 24 hours, we had artists doing experiments, basically realizing them, testing experiments. Obviously, an experiment in public can always fail, and failure is very, very important. Now, Marina Abramovic did this wonderful experiment where she actually played Dr. Abramovic and did experiments on museum visitors. Here, John Brockman of Edge. One of the things which is also very important is that we want to connect to science. We believe it is very important, again, that humanities, art, connect to science, that we build this bridge. So we've had a very strong dialogue with John Brockman, who is the inventor and founder of Edge.org. And with him, we've developed in the Experiment Marathon a whole series of science experiments, which he brought in, and we invited artists and scientists to write formulas. Here, for example, the legendary John Baldessari, he came from LA and transformed a glass of water into a glass of wine, back into a glass of water. Here are some of the formulas. I mean, there were hundreds of formulas. You can see them on the Serpentine side and also on the Edge side. The formula of Louise Bourgeois, a very wonderful message she sent us about love. The year after, in the Frank Gehry Pavilion, the Speaker's Corner, because somehow Serpentine is in Kensington Garden next to Hyde Park, and even if Speaker Corner happens now more on the internet, there are still people, using Speaker's Corner, and we felt it would be interesting to do a Manifesta marathon and invite 60, 70 participants, because we're living in a time which is more atomized. There are less cohesive artistic movements, so are there still manifestos? Or is it, as Tino Segal says, that maybe manifestos are very masculine, kind of very 20th century, and maybe the 21st century is more of a conversation? That's what we really wanted to find out here. One example is the manifesto of Rashid Arain. The year after, Seiji Manichizawa's Pavilion hosted a marathon about poetry. Similarly to the Lorca project, we felt that it's very important that we reconnect the art world to the world of poetry. The world of poetry, which never has developed into an industry, but is so fundamental, and all the great avant-gardes of the 20th century had connections to poetry. So we invited poets and artists to read poetry. And then the year after, we thought, in the Jean Nouvel Pavilion, we thought somehow it would be interesting to find a theme which connects more again to technology. And I was very fascinated that coming from the art world, maps play a super big role in the art world. You always have artists who draw maps. Conceptual art is full of maps. Artists are obsessed by maps. And I suddenly realized that maps have become, besides social network, one of the biggest topics on the internet. I mean, the whole idea of navigation systems. So we thought it could maybe be interesting to bring artists, web designers, architects together to think about mapping. So we had, for example, here Aaron Coblin, who is a digital web designer, presenting his real-time maps, in conjunction with many visual artists. Or we had Kader Attia presenting his idea of mapping of language. This year, we have a pavilion by Peter Zumthor and a garden by Piet Udorf. You can still see until October. And again, in many conversations, we started to think that maybe here the theme should just be the garden. Because, again, the garden is a theme which many, many artists, architects, writers, poets, novelists have been obsessed by. But at the same time, it's a very, very interesting notion on the internet. As Alexander Kluge wrote in his text for the catalog, it's about a garden of information. And this is a hortus conclusus. Peter Zumthor built a hortus conclusus in which Piet Udorf's garden is. Can there be such a thing as a hortus conclusus on the internet? So we will have, in October, 60, 70 participants from all fields discussed this idea of what is a garden for the 21st century. And as you can see, these marathons take us away from space. If at the beginning I was very interested in inventing new spaces, producing new spaces, I started to think more and more we could also use Glissant's idea of a variety for different temporalities. And this man has been, besides Glissant, another great inspiration. It's Diaghilev. Diaghilev is the founder of the Ballet Russe. He was an art curator, and at some point actually realized that he wanted to bring together all the arts through ballet. So if it's Picasso or Stravinsky or the great dancers, choreographers of his time, they all met through ballet. And that's really what I try to do with the exhibition, because I think we're living in a time where the art world allows us to do that. At the time of Diaghilev, it was ballet. I think now, through the art world, we can bring together all the different disciplines. I think it's quite extraordinary to revisit this whole idea of Diaghilev now. And he was a great inspiration for our first opera, which Philippe Pareno and I curated for the Manchester International Festival. A great festival where actually Peter Saville, the artistic director, and Alex Poots, the festival director, have actually in Manchester developed the idea of a festival where everything is new. Things happen which cannot be produced anywhere else. So it's almost like utopia becoming real. And our project was that we're giving artists time and not space. So from Philippe Pareno to Matthew Barney and his sort of almost burial of the Cremaster ritual to the Ratte and Bear of Fischli Weiss. There was a whole evening program where it was basically the visitor was in the opera and the artist did the opera. And I was mentioning utopia, Manchester being a kind of a concrete utopia, and that leads me really to the last thing I wanted to talk about. I think the notion of utopia has always fascinated me a lot, and it is not the classical utopia, because I agree with Glissant that the classical utopia, such as Plato's Republic or Thomas More's Utopia, are kind of very static system. Glissant thought that utopia should be somehow concrete, they should be a continuous dialogue, and Ernst Bloch said, utopia is something that is missing. Glissant wrote a beautiful novel called Sartorius in 1999, and he described an utopian Batutu people who actually derived their identity not from their own genealogy, but solely from being in constant exchange with others. Glissant referred to his utopia as a quivering or trembling utopia. He called it a kind of a tremblement, a trembling. And I'd like to read here one last quote from him. It must be said from the start that trembling is not uncertainty, and it is not fear. Trembling thought, and in my opinion, every utopia passes through this kind of thought, is first of all the instinctive feeling that we must reject all categories of fixed thought and all categories of imperial thought. The all world trembles. The all world trembles physically, geologically, mentally, spiritually, because the all world is looking for the point, not the station, but the utopian point where all the world's cultures, all the world's imaginations can meet and hear one another without dispersing or losing themselves. And that, I think, is utopia above all. Utopia is a reality where one can meet with the other without losing himself or herself. And that whole idea of concrete utopia leads us to the very last point, and I think I have 10 seconds, so I need to accelerate, which is my dream, because I've got a dream. I've got a dream. In all my interviews, and I've always been interviewing artists and architects and scientists, it's a kind of a parallel activity to my project, is to do oral history. It always ends with the question, what is your unrealized project? I love this idea that all of us have unrealized projects, dreams, projects which have been too big to be realized, too small to be realized. Censorship occurs, censor projects, projects which have forgotten. And as Doris Lessing told me, most importantly also self-censorship, things we might not have dared to do. So I'm making this very gigantic archive, now for 19 years, of unrealized projects, where we have so far about 3,000 projects. And here you see one, which is Alighiero Boetti, the late visionary Italian artist. He wanted to put this tree on a very, very high earth column, which is a wonderful sort of monument, anti-monument. And my dream is really to one day, if in 1851 there was the Crystal Palace in London, if then in 1960-61 Cedric Price wanted to come up with the Fun Palace, or the Crystal Palace, the Fun Palace, my dream is to one day have a palace, a very big building, with all these unrealized projects, and to maybe help make them happen. Thank you very much.